Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. I'm Gary Polland.
And I'm Dallas Jones.
This week on Red, White, and Blue, our guest is Edward Djerejian. Edward is the head of the Baker Institute at Rice and a former ambassador to Syria and Israel, and an awesome guest in the area of foreign policy.
Welcome.
Pleasure to be with you, gentlemen.
What got you into the Foreign Service?
Oh, my God. Well, I was the son of political refugees, an Armenian family who, my parents lost their parents in the massacres after World War I, during World War I, in Turkey and Armenia. And they emigrated to the United States in the 1920s. America welcomed them. The great story of American immigration and giving opportunities to the bereaved of the world. And I felt an obligation somehow to give back. And I said it'd be a great honor to serve this country. And I was very interested in foreign policy. And I went to Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, then went into the military, and then went right into the diplomatic service after that.
You've been at Rice and the Baker Institute for a quarter of a century?
Well, I'm the founding director of the Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. It's been a wonderful ride. We created this institute in the name of James A. Baker III. We become an integral part of the university, but even more so, we have become one of the leading global think tanks. And I don't say that in any vain way. It's simply that we've been ranked now for the last several years as the third best university-affiliated think tank in the world, preceded by the London School of Economics and Harvard's Belfer Center. And our Center for Energy Studies has been ranked the first in the world. So we've come a long way. We've become a forum for national and international leaders. We've had Nelson Mandela, Gorbachev, Putin. Every American living former president of the United States, from Gerald Ford to Barack Obama, has been hosted at the Institute. But more important than that, it's the research and the scholars and the fellows that we have at the Rice University's Baker Institute who do original research on domestic and foreign policy issues that really are our life work.
Let me ask you, we were just having a conversation before we started taping here, and I shared with you that I had the opportunity to visit Israel and take
Yes.
a firsthand view of what's happening in terms of the geopolitical situation there. For our viewers, could you give an overview of where we are right now in terms of the United States, our relationship with Israel, and what you see as some of the challenges in our current policy in regards to Israel and the Middle East?
Well, first, it's a very challenging time in the relationship because the situation on the ground is very troublesome. People talk about the status quo between Israel and the Palestinians, but frankly, we've come to the determination it's better to describe it as a continuation of no agreement, because status quos are not static. In all my years of service in the Middle East, when you have a status quo, bad things happen. Mm-hmm. And we've seen wars, civil wars, terrorism, you name it. So fundamentally, the stalemated Arab-Israeli peace process is a definite challenge to American policymakers and certainly to the Israelis and their Arab neighbors. And I think that is one of the key issues. I would like to see the United States policy go from just conflict management to conflict resolution. How do we resolve these problems, not just manage one crisis after another? That's a challenge for all administrations, Democratic and Republican. Right now, nothing can be done with Syria because Syria is in chaos. And so there's no negotiations over the Golan Heights will take place until some distant future, I would think, when Syria is stabilized. But the key issue, and Israel, as you know, has peace treaties with Egypt, has peace treaties with Jordan. It does not have a peace treaty with Lebanon, but that would be relatively easy to do if there was a general comprehensive agreement, because there's no real border issue between Israel and Lebanon. But you have Hezbollah in Lebanon, and that's a real threat to Israel.
An Iranian subsidiary.
Truly an Iranian proxy. There's no question that Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy, a very powerful one, very well armed, and ideologically very powerful as a Shiite movement. But to me, Israel's existential threat is not so much Iran as is the current perception, I think, certainly by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who really reiterates the Iranian threat. Iran is a major threat in the region. It's a threat to Israel because of the Hezbollah proxy. It has Iranian troops and IRGC units are in Syria. It supports the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza. So Iran is a definite threat to Israel. But in terms of existential threat, I think the lack of an agreement between Israel and Palestine is the real existential threat. Why do I say that? Because if there is not an agreement between Israel and Palestine for a two-state solution, where the lines are drawn, there are recognized borders, some of these major Israeli settlements are consolidated within a new line, you have security arrangements, you have an agreement on Jerusalem, you have an agreement in principle on Palestinian refugees, and you separate the Palestinian state from the Israeli state. So there are two independent states living in peace and security next to one another. That will preserve really the goal of Zionism, which is the democratic Jewish state. The question is, how can Israel remain democratic if it continues to occupy millions of Palestinians? What does that do to a democracy when you're occupying another people? Okay. And secondly, how do you retain your Jewish identity if the Palestinian Arabs are just demographically growing at a higher rate than you are, that over a decade or so, they will be the majority? Not the Jews between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, the Palestinian Arabs will be the majority. So just keep in mind that a hardline prime minister like Netanyahu posits his goal is a democratic Jewish state. The question I pose is, how can you really guarantee a democratic Jewish state if you don't divide in a peace agreement?
Well, you were involved. How many years have you been involved in dealing with Arab-Israeli talks, negotiations?
Too many.
40?
Too
45
many.
years. I mean, a lot. And some of the things you say I don't agree with. If you look at the demographics, actually, because of the improved medical care that's taken place because of Israel's involvement with the Palestinians, their birth rate's gone down. So actually the Jewish birth rate's higher because of the Orthodox Jews, which creates other issues.
Gary,
by the
the
way.
Orthodox Jews are a minority of the population.
I said,
but we disagree on the statistics.
We disagree.
But I think my numbers are right.
But I don't disagree. No.
I'd go with his numbers, Gary.
Yeah, but that's okay.
I mean, go to Israeli sources on this.
I have Israeli sources.
Go to Israeli sources on this, and you'll see.
Yeah, former Ambassador Yoram Ettinger has done some work there in this area.
Right.
That's interesting. But that doesn't separate out the other question. Here's the problem that's taken place over the years. As you know, the frustration, there have been numerous opportunities to make deals, and the answer from the Palestinian leadership, not necessarily the people, has always been no. And you give Bill Clinton, Bush 1, Bush 2, I mean, it goes all the way back. That we've had numerous opportunities, even back in 1948, when they tried to cut a deal and were told, instead, we're going to invade. So the difficulty is you got to have someone to say yes on the other side. And the fear that the Palestinian leadership, I believe, is that some of the more radicals, the really super radicals in the Palestinian movement, would assassinate those who get involved with the peace process, like what happened to Sadat. So you end up with that problem. You got to have someone to talk to.
There is someone to go talk to. There have been valid interlocutors on the Palestinian side. Some have been very troublesome. Some, on your right, have walked away from the table when the opportunity was there. Arafat did that at one point. I agree with you on that. But believe me, over the last few years, he's been terribly weakened politically now. But Mohammed Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, Abu Mazen, has been a valid interlocutor for peace.
But there hadn't been any process.
But there has been, and because
that's true.
So I mean, there has been an interlocutor, but there's fault on both sides.
Well,
Gary.
do you think that when Israel left Gaza under Sharon. I mean, they left. They pulled all the settlements out,
Right.
gave it to the Palestinian Authority, who promptly lost it to
Hamas.
unfortunately.
Right.
Did you think that was a factor in things falling apart, that if Palestinian Authority had actually gotten control of Gaza and taken advantage of all the money for economic development as opposed to subsidizing terrorists who kill Israelis, that maybe we would be at that point?
No, I agree with you on that. But the thing is that Ariel Sharon, you can't question his right-wing and hardline positions, and I worked with, I knew Ariel Sharon. He decided that negotiations were not possible, but that Israel somehow had to separate in order to maintain its identity. So he made the decision as prime minister to withdraw unilaterally. The problem was it was not a bilateral agreement, so the other side had no obligations. That's why you see rockets going from Hamas into, or PIG, the Palestinian Islamic State, going into Ashkelon in southern Israel, because there was no agreement that obligated the other side. So that's a mistake. I don't believe in unilateral withdrawals.
Right.
The withdrawals have to be negotiated, and they should be bilateral.
All right, I wanted to kind of mention Iran.
Sure.
Iran. You mentioned that Iran is a big problem, but I want to kind of switch focus to, and it's part of it, it's Iran and foreign policy by tweeting. Okay, so under President Trump, he essentially followed the Obama foreign policy with Iran. With Syria, he draws a line in the sand and threatens that something's going to happen, and then nothing happens. What does that do for our credibility as the world power that we're supposed to be?
Well, I don't think any American president, Democratic or Republican, should draw a line in the sand or put a marker down and saying, if this line is crossed, there will be consequences, and does nothing. That absolutely really diminishes American credibility and its ability to conduct foreign relations in an effective manner. So I agree that no line should be drawn unless you mean it. If you aim a gun, you should be willing to pull the trigger if that line is crossed. So that's a mistake that I hope will not be repeated by any president going forward. The best thing is to be more tactful and say nothing, rather than to draw these lines that oblige you to react. You can be an American president and say the Iranians do something very negative, and you can make a decision how to react to that, whether you've drawn a line or not. That's the more intelligent way to conduct foreign and national security policy.
So, so since we're talking about this, President, it has been, and again, through my conversation with some of the Palestinian leadership, it's been their perception that the possibility of peace has broken down under this president more than any other, because he's taken such a relationship with Netanyahu, and involved himself in the domestic politics of Israel, but even more so with certain moves that some, even in the global community, have deemed as being unnecessary to really stall the process, and from their perspective, make the U.S. not an honest broker as it's supposed to be in achieving peace. How do you feel this president has affected the current state of negotiations to a two-state solution?
Well, I think by doing what you've described, by making all these gestures toward Israel that are important, like moving our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, recognizing the extension of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights.
Yes.
I mean, all of these measures are unilateral on our part, and what do we get for it? Well, we get the goodwill of the Israeli Prime Minister and a lot of the Israeli public opinion, who consider this to be a very friendly government to Israel, and I can see that. But in negotiations, why make these gestures without engaging in the role of an honest broker to try to get the parties to the negotiating table and use these as incentives for Israel to make certain concessions, and then doing equal things on the Palestinian side to make them make the necessary connections? I think our role of an honest broker has been seriously damaged.
Wow.
Seriously damaged. And I think that And the why has the United States been the most important interlocutor in Israeli-Arab peace negotiations? Because the United States is the only country the Israelis have any faith in and trust to be involved in their negotiations. When I was ambassador to Israel, I have a lot of respect for Yitzhak Rabin, the assassinated prime minister. He was a warrior, a great warrior in Israeli history, who became a statesman and worked for peace, because toward the end of his years, he realized that there is not a military solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. There has to be a political settlement. And even, I was just sitting next to him in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, there were times when he would confide to me that he was uncomfortable, even with the United States being the interlocutor for Israel, because we would be giving him direct messages of what we were telling the Syrians, the Palestinians, the Jordanians, and he was all for that because the United States is the best friend of Israel. But at the same time, if you're the Prime Minister of Israel, these are issues of war and peace for your country, existential issues, you want to be involved directly. Having said that, we have undermined our position as an honest broker in this administration.
Now, what about Putin? Putin has got his nose everywhere. Putin has met with Netanyahu, 10 times, 15 times. Putin is coming to Israel for some dedication to Russians who died during World War II. I mean, and he's got his nose in Syria. Obviously, he's got troops in Syria. He's building an air base, etc. So, how does that all fit into all this?
Well, Putin thinks the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the fall of communism. So he's a Russian patriot, Russian nationalist. He's also an autocrat. And if you look at Russia, it remains a power largely because of its nuclear arsenal. But the economy of Russia, the Russian Federation, which is used territorially, is the equivalent of the economy of Spain or Italy. So you got to put things in perspective. So putting those things in perspective, Putin is playing a very clever but weak hand. He's playing it very cleverly in the Middle East. We are playing a very strong hand, I think, not very cleverly in the Middle East. So Putin's goal is to extend Russian influence in the Middle East, in Syria, in the Gulf, in Libya, wherever he can. But he doesn't represent the Soviet Union anymore. The Soviet Union's gone. So it's limited what he can do. But he's playing a weak hand very cleverly.
It's fascinating.
So let's shift a little bit to Netanyahu and the inability for him to form a government in the Knesset. Does he make it?
Very problematic. I mean, no one predicts Netanyahu's downfall because he has succeeded in the past of always surprising everyone. So I'm not going to get into the role of a prophet here, but having said that, he's in real trouble. First, he has these 3 indictments against him, which are, in a few days, they're going to be the pre-indictment hearings in Israel, and they're serious indictments. They're not.
Maybe.
Well, they're serious. They're serious, and he's very troubled by them, and that's why he's been seeking immunity through the Knesset.
Right.
That he's trying
that
to.
True.
I mean, if they weren't serious, Gary, he wouldn't be that. He wouldn't be trying to, get immunity. So he's personally and politically obviously in trouble because of that. But what has happened is that his coalition with the ultra-Orthodox religious parties and the extreme right wing in Israel, which is his base, troubles a lot of Israelis who are more secularist. And for example, the deal maker now is Lieberman, a Russian Jew who was an oligarch, and but he's established his own party in Israel, and he's a powerful political force. He's the deal maker in all of this between the Gantz and his coalition and the others, and he is allergic to religious parties being in government, and that is a direct threat to Netanyahu. Trying to form a government, because if you have Lieberman with his, I don't know how many seats, 8. He has 8 seats. that could block anything that Netanyahu can do. A lot depends on Gantz and his coalition and how they're going to proceed. But the president of Israel, Rivlin, has the authority in his own judgment. He can pick anyone from the Knesset who he thinks may have a chance of putting together a coalition of 61 or more. He can pick anybody. But we're going to see in the next few days what his decision is. So you have two things going. A bit similar to what's happening in our country. You have indictments and litigations and partisan politics. I don't know if the partisanship in Israel is worse than the partisanship in our country. All I know, it's rough politics in both countries.
Absolutely.
It's absolutely rough politics. But the point here is that right now, the situation in Israel is stalemated. The internal political situation, and we're going to just have to see. I think the worst thing, and the Israelis don't want this, is the third election. If they have to go to a third election, that's going to be quite disruptive.
Well, what would be the impact of an emboldened Iran attacking Israel like they attacked Saudi Arabia?
I don't think if Iran attacks Israel, I don't think
Israel would respond.
Oh yeah, I mean, Israel is not a declared nuclear power, but it is a nuclear power.
They told me they were nuclear neutral.
Yes, I love that phrase. That's right. They say they're nuclear neutral, and it's a studied policy of ambiguity. But everybody knows that Israel is a serious nuclear power. But even beyond that, its military might is so strong that the Israeli military can confront any combination of Middle East, certainly Arab and Iranian forces against it. But Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. But Iran does have ballistic missiles. It has Hezbollah. See, the problem in the Middle East now is not so much what we would consider conventional warfare. Forget about it. No one's going to use nuclear weapons because the other side doesn't have, and Israel is not going to use nuclear weapons. Unless there's some incredible imminent threat to it that I don't see from any of the Arab or even Iran. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. The problem militarily in the Middle East is asymmetric warfare. When I was in Israel recently, the military intelligence, and they're saying this publicly, I'm not giving away any secrets, one of their greatest concerns is a war on Israel's northern border with Lebanon and Hezbollah. Hezbollah has at least 130,000 missiles of different ranges. But now, because in the terrible Lebanese war, Israeli war in 2006, they hit northern Israeli targets. Now they can go all the way down south of Tel Aviv. And this would be devastating. And the Israeli military intelligence officers state publicly, and they're signaling their neighbors, if we're in a confrontation with Hezbollah and it uses its rockets, we're going all the way into Lebanon because we will hold the Lebanese government, certain elements of which are in alliance with Hezbollah, responsible. This is heavy threats, but I think it's a credible threat because you talk about it's not an existential threat, it's not going to destroy Israel, but the price of the injured and the fatalities will be simply too high to countenance. So it's asymmetric warfare. It's the same thing in the Gulf. What you saw in Abqaiq, the strike on the Saudi Arabian Aramco facilities, huge. But the Iranians are using proxies. And fundamentally, this is the threat. And the Iranians are superb masters of using proxies. They have proxy forces in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Yemen. And so this is one of the key challenges. That's why I hope that during the discussions that are going on now, it's amazing. This major strike on one of the major oil facilities in the world, and people started talking about military confrontation and reaction right away. You see how everyone has withdrawn from the brink? And there are discussions going on now between the Iranians and certain Arab countries and us. And I think French President Macron is playing a role of intermediary. Certain other states are. So people have stepped back from the brink because they realize if there's an all-out war in the Middle East, it'll be devastating for all concerned.
No real winners.
No real winners.
All right, we got 50 seconds left.
That's all?
Yeah, I told you time flies. Well, we didn't talk about China. We didn't get to talk about India and Pakistan and Kashmir. What keeps you up at night? That's my final question.
What keeps me up at night in the Middle East?
No, in the world.
In the world? The thing that keeps me up at night is the incredible deterioration of our political discourse in this country. I'm old enough to remember when Tip O'Neill would go to the White House with President Reagan, and they'd have a scotch together, and they'd talk politics they would have a conversation. We've lost the ability to have conversations. I think the incredible social media where people just latch on to the sources that live up to their political prejudices is terrible.
Well, time's up, unfortunately.
Oh,
we're going to have to have you back, Ambassador.
Okay.
Because you're absolutely right. I think we agree. The political discourse in this country is essentially in the toilet.
Yeah.
It's a joke.
And that's what keeps
And
me
on
up.
that happy note, we'll be back next week with another exciting show and guest, Gary Polland and my good friend Dallas Jones for more political discourse.